Hello again, folks, and welcome back to World War II TV. And we are still here talking about France in World War II. And of all the shows this week, I'm looking forward to them all, but I'm particularly looking forward to this one because, as you know, most of you are watching this, I live in Normandy. I've been a tour guide here for 20 years. My partner, Mag, is also a tour guide. She was born in the town of Saint-Lô. So Saint-Lô, if you're from Normandy, everyone knows the story of Saint-Lô. Nearly put to rubble in World War II because of the bombing. And to me, as a Normandy tour guide, the bombing of France is one of those subjects that is not addressed enough, needs to be talked about more, and we have got a perfect guest to talk about tonight. I will tell you before I introduce him how I discovered his book, or why I purchased his book, which I have right here. It was the title that got to me. Beyond the Beach, the Allied War Against France. It was the word against that really piqued my attention there, because it was talking about the bombing campaign in a different way than is normally told. And so I'm absolutely delighted tonight to introduce my guest. He is a professor of history. He has taught in numerous military colleges and civilian colleges around the USA. He's written several books. He's writing another book now, and he is my guest today. So Dr. Stephen Bourque, good evening, sir, or good afternoon. How are you doing today?
Glad to be here. Glad to be here, Bob.
So before we get into the bombing of France, you've been teaching military history for some time. You're an army veteran of 20 years. At what point, perhaps in your career, did you realize that this aspect of the war in France is kind of underappreciated and particularly written about, perhaps badly?
Yeah, so I used to take students from I taught at Cal State Northridge. I used to take students to France regularly. And we just finished up a trip, and then my buddy and I hopped into a car and drove across Europe for a couple of weeks, which is our normal way of operation after the students left. On the way back, we stopped in Metz and checked into the local hotel and spent the night there, had a good dinner. And in the morning, went over for breakfast and over at the train station. And at the train station, of course, there was a big monument on the wall, a stela, I think they call it. And it essentially had to the French railway memorial to the French railway workers who died in the summer of 1944. And I'm looking at that, and I've been studying World War II and military operations for a long time, and I'm going, we did that. There were no Germans bombing in summer of 1944, not many. So I walked over to a local bookstore and I found a journalist account, Eddie Florentine's when the Allies bombed France, and I started reading it. It's like, oh my! But there's nothing at all scholarly about that in the United States. So, I mean, I went looking and couldn't find anything. Usually, in all the histories of World War II, it's air power on steroids. The bomber war. And all that, and so I said, let me look into this. And the more I looked, the more I dug into it. It just kept getting better. So it took me a long time, almost 10 years. It's hard to write. It's hard to write French history when you live in the United States using French sources. Means you got to
hard to write French history when you live in France with the way the archives work here. But yes,
you got to get into departmental archives. You got to get into the police reports. You got to get down low. And so that's what really intrigued me. And of course, there's none of this back here in the States. If I could, let me just put a caveat or two that I think people ought to realize. I'm not anti-Air Force. That comes across a number of times. I've spoken at down at the Maxwell Air War College stuff. I'm not anti-Air Force. In fact, this whole story is about things the Air Force did not want to do, especially the heavy bombers. They did not want to be bombing France. Based on DDay and Trenchard and all the bomber barons, Billy Mitchell from the States, they wanted to take the war to Germany. They truly believed, and Spatz, the commander of the Strategic Air Forces, truly, on the eve of DDay, he's still saying this invasion is not necessary. We can end the war by just bombing the Germans. So up front, I'm not doing this to bash the Air Force, although I've been accused of that. It was the Army, it was Montgomery and Eisenhower specifically who demanded using the heavy bombers. The tactical bombers were always going to be their second tactical Air Force, and the Ninth were always going to be part of it. But they demanded, and it goes back to bad experiences in Italy, where they had trouble getting what they needed, the bombing support. Of course, the Air Force, the air guys in both Britain and the United States, they overpromised. They said, we can do all these kind of things for you. And everybody, they were taking them at their word in the spring of 1944. another thing I think is important is that up front is casualties are a part of war. I mean, again, I spent my life much of my life as a soldier, but destroying ancient structures and killing wounded civilians, especially friendly civilians, that's generally unacceptable. The idea that everything a officer wants to do or general wants to do is military necessity just isn't good. It's not the way to be. And one more thing, in defense of everybody we talk about this today, they are learning. There's no doctrine. There's no history of air power. They're making judgments and assessments before the strategic bombing surveys come out and before the other they really don't know what they're doing, and they're very, very young. The senior guys are in their 30s, making huge decisions. So just a caveat up front.
And that's worth mentioning, because with Dr. Matthew Powell yesterday, we were talking about the air battle in France in 1940, when people in the Royal Air Force are looking at doctrine in the late 1930s. 6-7 years later, there are aircraft in the air they couldn't have possibly conceived at the time they were thinking about doctrine. The way aviation technology progressed from 1939 in still really the back end of the biplane era to 1946, and the British having the jet, the Glossier Meteor jet in the air. No one saw that happening. No one saw that increase of technology. So I completely agree that by 1944 they're dealing with a technology they couldn't have possibly thought of,
and it's still very primitive. It's still incredibly primitive. I mean, the number of times they're looking for targets, even on D-Day, looking for targets and can't find them. And it's only across the channel, and they can't find the targets.
And on D-Day, we're talking, of course, about targets they have taken thousands of photos of. They've mapped, they've surveyed, they know, and they still can't. But anyway, we're in danger of going down all these rabbit holes of the side conversation before we even begin. But as usual, my guest has come with an arm with a PowerPoint. So we're going to be looking at the challenging the traditional narratives of the air war against France, and particularly Normandy, in the kind of, well, not just 1944, because we're starting in 1942. So we'll begin. So let's talk about Rouen, Stephen.
Yeah, and the only reason I put Rouen, and that's a way I usually end presentations. I like to talk about what happened that day. A good friend of mine lives in Rouen, so we spent a lot of time talking about it. They don't capture in many ways what was going on that day, essentially. It was the first time the U.S. Air Force conducts an independent mission over France, August 17th, 1942, and it's a big deal. And again, you have air. I'm trying to get pictures, get some notes. You have air guys, just so excited they're going to do it. The RAF is going to provide. We have no air support, fighter support. So the British are provide. Royal Air Force is providing all kinds of fire support. And essentially, they go off, and you can't miss Rouen. We talk about. It's like if you're flying, it's like you cross the channel, you find the mouth of the Seine, you take a right, and you fly on down. So you can't miss the city.
Follow it till you get to the big city where the river is.
You get to the first city on the left. You can't miss it. And that's about how primitive these guys are sometimes. But interesting. One of my stories where my friend's father was out with his family there. They go off to Dieppe for the holiday. They come back, and on the way back they all go to the train station. The father goes to the train station. They meet them there, and then the kids, the husband and the wife and the kids are walking back home. And that's the moment the bombers came in. The kids had just run ahead. And so what ends up happening, the family and the daughter are both killed. The family, the daughter, and the youngest child are both killed. And the two older kids are able to escape it. Well, my friend Paul tells me all about how his uncle has to go back and find the bodies, identify the bodies and everything. His father never recovers from that. To the rest of his life, his father never recovers from that. And so again, it's very moving about it. Here's a picture of, you see where the bombs are hitting. I mean, they're supposed to hit the rail yard down in Sotteville, which is where the bottom, and you can see where the bombs hit, where my friend's father, my friend's uncle and comrades were killed right there. So it's pretty pretty ugly day for Rouen. But it's indicative of what will happen. And of course, I have the picture of that there of Ira Aker, who was the commander of the 8th Air Force at the time. These guys are all out there patting each other on the back. It's a great mission. It vindicates strategic bombing. No one says a word about how many bombs miss the target, about what happens to those in the city, how many deaths. I mean, they have no data on any of that stuff. And again, if you read the reports that come out, the journalists talk about it being the Army, Air Force talks about it being propaganda. Oh, that's Vichy propaganda, about the people that are dead. No, I've read out through the police reports as we go into the war, these are accurate numbers.
Yeah, and it's interesting that 1942 era is foreshadowing a lot of things from 1944. We get, for example, the commando raid we've talked about on World War II TV, Operation Aquatint, that went badly wrong, that kind of foreshadows the events of Omaha 2 years later. Because, as you said there, this Rouen event does eerily foreshadow the events of 2 years later, when bombing, which has theoretically got more accurate by then, actually in practice hasn't always got more accurate. And yeah, it's the Rouen story is fascinating. I was there in Rouen with Mag last year, I think, and you can still see damage in the town.
Yes.
Okay, some of that damage is from 44 rather than 42, but there's very little there in the town in the way of memorials about the bombing raid. It seems to have been rather overlooked.
If you see the bomb, the British do a horrendous bombing on April 19th, 44. Horrendous when they're going after the rail yards again, and of course they miss terribly. And there's a little place in the center of the city it's moving. Have you ever seen the monument? It shows a mother and child looking up at the sky. Of course, that whole area was just totally leveled. With about 900 civilians killed that day, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds wounded. It's just amazing that takes place. And I already mentioned WWII Bouque. That's the stela that's in Rouen, in fact.
Yeah. And yeah, the why for the book, I think, is very necessary. I mean, even in Saint-Lô, we were discussing last night, I'm interrupting, I'll let you talk again, is Mag and I were talking about the shell that's inside of the church in Saint-Lô, and how often if you ask a French person there, they'll refer to it as being a German shell, when in reality it's almost certainly an Allied shell. I mean, there's very little chance of it being a German shell there, but somehow even the people in the town, because the Germans were the overriding enemy, have somehow shifted their own recollections of it to make the story less, I don't know what the word is, less damaging. It's very interesting how that's happened over the years.
Yeah, I've had a discussion with an archivist in Saint-Lô at the departmental archives there, and he was just appalled just when I was starting my work, and he was just absolutely appalled that the story has been totally turned upside down in terms of what actually happened. Again, it's like the Americans aren't that popular in Saint-Lô. They may be popular along the beaches, but of course that's business now. That's business.
Yeah. Which brings us to the American D-Day narrative. So I mean, I'm really been looking forward to your feelings about this, and so away you go.
I mean, this is it. I mean, this is it, isn't it? I mean, this is what the average American, unless you were studying World War II at the university, this is or a very avid reader of the topic, this is what you know about it. Well, you had we came ashore on D-Day. Longest day, Band of Brothers, Teddy. I mean, the great talk, which is really moving. You end up crying. Ronald Reagan's that kind of guy at the cemeteries, and then of course somewhere in the middle of all that, Patton comes ashore, and then next thing you know, you're at the Bulge. I mean, it ignores so much of the war. It just ignores so much of the war. It ignores the fact that Courtney Hodges' first army goes faster, further than George Patton's army goes. It covers all that fighting on the left. It gives, obviously no credit to Montgomery and the Commonwealth forces. They got no credit. So it's very much an American narrative. And I think the epitome of that is that Dick Winters monument. I mean, the Dick Winters monument, it's now at D-Day. I mean, it comes out that the Band of Brothers thing, and Dick Winters, obviously a fantastic soldier, citizen soldier, the par excellence, the American tradition. But to put a monument up there that's, wait a minute. I mean, come on. If you want to put there are places to put monuments. And that's just this. I respect the man incredibly, but I'm not sure it was the right thing to do. Or just north of that area up in Krisbeck is an incredible place where the Germans and Americans, Germans in the 4th Division, just fought it out. And there's no monument outside there that talks about that fighting. I mean, it's been taken over now as a museum, but that's incredible fighting, or further north of that. So.
And San Marcouf, the village in which Krisbeck is part of, has suffered the most civilian casualties on D-Day in La Manche, and that's where Mag's family is from there. So, is there anything in San Marcouf honoring or commemorating the fact that it suffered the most civilians?
No, you know where you find those? You find those in the cemeteries. You go to the gravestone, you go to the headstone, and said, in memory of this family killed by the bombardment on June 6th. That's where you find them. I've yet to see. I didn't see anything in San Marcouf. Nothing.
Yeah, it's just, again, not part of the story. So
very rarely, once in a while, you'll travel through a little town and there'll be something on the side. Usually in memorial of the Sapeur Pompier, and the civil defense, those kind of guys. Yeah.
So we'll move on. So the air power narrative.
Yeah, and so that's the other one, of course, which is fascinating to me, of course. Not to drag out too much into this stuff, but the bottom line is, you got to remember that in 1944, the U.S. Air Force is trying to become independent. And so everything that comes out of there, they're not going to talk about bad things. They're not going to talk very much about things that like bombing French targets. They're going to do that as little as possible. And in fact, in the official history, it's written by the guy who was the 9th Air Force historian. We look at that, and so there's no discussion of any detail. And they mention it, but they really don't go into the casualties. They don't go into the effects. They really like doing the story of fighting in Germany. If you're going to Germany, that's what they want to talk about. When reality is, until September 1944, most air missions, bombing missions, were done over friendly occupied territory. I mean, that's a statement. Until September 1944, the heavy bombers of the U.S. and the Royal Air Force carried out most of their missions over friendly territory. They've got the statistics; they're all there. That's an interesting statement.
And the narrative, the historiography as well, the narrative. I mean, we do talk about the Amiens prison raid because that was heroic and it saved people, but the other more devastating raids, you're right, they have been mostly kind of dropped from the narrative until we get to the bombing of Germany, and we talk about the bombing of the Ruhr and the dam busters and all those, then the Cologne and the ball bearing plants. But the fact that we were bombing friendly countries for the majority of the middle part of the war is overlooked. I think.
So they've got it. They created the narrative, and again, these are just brief run-throughs that talk about everybody who's involved in that has a different perspective. I mean, I always think about the Georgian and Ukrainian troops fighting against the Americans as they come ashore. What? What? What's their perspective about? What are they thinking? Or the old fortress troops, they got family back home, and of course, one of the things that I always have to put out for my Canadian friends is throwing a shout out to them that they aren't the British Army. They are the Canadian Army. And Americans often forget that, much to our peril if we do. And of course, it's the Canadians definitely have their own history here. And of course, the other one is always fascinating is the number of Poles that are fighting with the Commonwealth countries. That's always amazing. They have a different narrative, but all these different perspectives of fighting, all of these different perspectives are a different narrative than the American narrative or the Anglo-American narrative.
Yeah. And then we come to the one that is the most ignored of all, which is the French narrative. And just for a bit of context, I was talking with on our first show on Monday with Cedric Mass, who did a wonderful presentation about the Battle of Bir Hakeim in the North African desert of 42. And we were saying about, because he's from Normandy like me, when you go into a Normandy bookshop in a museum or conventional, there are books in English by American and British authors for the American and British market, and there are books in French by French authors for the French markets, but very rarely do you see them translated across for the other people. So the great French historians like Jean Kellien and Christophe Prime and Gilles Perrault and Eddie Florentin, although he's long since gone, but his books were seminal back in the day. His Stalingrad in Normandy book about the Falaise Gap, they were rarely available in English. And the people who are writing like John McManus and yourself and James Holland rarely have their books in English. So the French narrative is told within France, but it's not understood, I don't think, by the English language students of World War II history.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. And again, the French, I'm very happy that, of course, my book was published in French, which is very happy. Coming out in paperback, by the way, in January.
Brilliant. And I should say, folks, the links to Stephen's book is in the description below. And I should have said that it is available in one of the few that's available in French. Although that said, I haven't seen it in the museums here. So we need to get your publisher to get in touch with the museum. I don't remember seeing it.
I've been there at Cannes. We had that conversation. The interesting thing to me about France, of course, Americans have no understanding of the complexity of French society. I mean, we've talked about our American Civil War, North and South. You have families that are divided right down the middle. Within the family that are fighting on both sides. You have people in the resistance, and you have people in the milice. Both are fighting against each other. You have people running anti-aircraft weapons while their other Frenchmen are flying bombers against them. You have the whole issue of collaboration. What level of collaboration? It just goes on and on. There are parts of France that aren't bombed, and of course they look at those parts that are bombed, and it's like, what's your complaint? It's just a very complex narrative. And you have to look at it where it takes place and who's there and who survives, who doesn't survive, and make some judgment about it. But I'm fascinated by narrative and how little you just have to appreciate it, and how little appreciation most American, and I assume British, have about what's going on inside. They don't talk about the bombings, for example. They really don't talk about the bombings until the last decade or so of the 20th century. Because they have too much other stuff going on. They're trying to rebuild. They got to deal with the collaboration issue. They got prisoners of war coming back. An amazing number of prisoners of war coming back. I mean, they got so much to deal with. It's not really until their children, start thinking about what was that bombing thing.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, we talk so often about how America was boom time, wasn't it, in 1945? Even 1944, the civilians in America, they got Coca-Cola again. The rubber shortages are starting to end there. France, where I live, the farms are still in ruins several years later. It took how many years to get the craters filled in? The apple orchard, 70% are destroyed. Saint-Lô destroyed. Le Havre destroyed. Caen destroyed. And that's just the major cities that rebuild the roads, rebuild the infrastructure, repopulate, because all the men who killed them. And so you're right. People are just too busy trying to get on with life to think about the commemoration. And, that didn't happen until 25, 50 years later when some of the veterans started coming back. But that post-war period, which is something Mag, my other half, talks about all the time, because it's important to understand. I mean, one of the things I always maintain is really the only country on the Allied side to win World War II was the USA. Britain have come out on the victorious side, but our country's broken economically and shattered. The France have got to deal with what they're rebuilding, as has Belgium, as have the Netherlands. Poland and the Eastern European countries that are on our side are now communist for the next 30 or 40 or 50 years. So only the USA really comes out of it with, in the 50s, your chrome on your Cadillacs and your booming economy and your white picket fences and your TV dinners and things like that. I'm not saying that disrespectfully. I'm saying it has affected. That baby boomer generation have come out thinking that the war ended in 1945 when peace started. But of course, the effect of the war were continuing for years, if not decades, here in this part of Europe.
Yeah, in fact, even in France, people think, well, that they were fighting in Germany. Well, Americans are still occupying French schools and buildings and stuff well after 1945. I mean, we don't just walk away. It takes a while, and creating all kinds of other problems. So, this is just an interesting map I throw up. It's done by French historians, of course, who do it just correctly. But up there in the north, but you can see up there in the whole Normandy area around Saint-Lô, you can see there. I mean, there it is. That whole area, the area around the Pas de Calais, that's the most bombed over place, in France, period. Because, they're bombing through everything from crossbow sites to industry to the fake Operation Fortitude, where they're taking out the coast. So that area, plus that's where the main German assault took place in 1940. So just interesting. The Loire, the bridge lines down there, and of course down there, and then further down south where the landings come in. Yeah,
there you got U-boat pens. Yeah.
The sub pens, obviously, yes. So again, it's a complex problem. A lot of bombing takes place, and a lot of different, but it's a narrative that Americans don't realize, and that's really why I wrote the book. And why bomb France? And the real issue is Eisenhower and Montgomery showing up in 1944. There's no real plan about what's going on. It's other than going after crossbow, and they're going after the V1 sites and the subpens. There's no real, and some of the factories, there's no serious plan. But the real issue is that Eisenhower and Montgomery were shook by the effectiveness of the Germans in the counterattack, both in North Africa, in Sicily. I mean, the Goering division almost throws the U.S. First Infantry back into the water in Sicily. And then, of course, the fighting that takes place in places like Anzio and Salerno. So they're very concerned. And what they want to, and now that Rommel is the guy in charge of the beach defenses, the last thing they want to do is to allow him open season on landing American troops. So that becomes, once Eisenhower and Montgomery show up in February, end of January, early February 44, this is when this sort of a haphazard Allied bombing effort against France, this is when it gets very focused. And now we're talking about a serious air offensive against targets in France. And there's no theory. Yeah, again, we have no idea what we're doing. There's no theory. It's DDay and the guys. We have no doctrine how to do it. There's no, very seldom is there a measure of the casualties. We talk about it from time to time. One of Churchill's great comments during his transportation plan is his commentary of how many Frenchmen did you kill today, where he asked Tedder that question. And these guys really, it's a very much a primitive operation in terms of targeting, navigation. I mean, it's very primitive stuff. So.
Yeah. And we're talking about the strategic bombing more than tactical bombing. I know we could branch off in the two. We've had Matt Bone on a few weeks ago talking about the bombing of some of the railway hubs and the radar installations, but that was precision stuff with Typhoons, and it's a little bit different to what we're talking about, which is the high level, high altitude kind of carpet bombing that we know even by 1945 when we get into Germany is still not getting to the accuracy that people were predicting or rather hoping for earlier in the war.
Exactly. And by the way, I don't use the term strategic.
Okay.
So a strategic bomber, a strategic, you talk about strategic, you're talking about politically directed. I'm using my army, my
okay. Yeah.
But you're talking about that's a campaign, and that's where the national political authorities, tell the commander, this is what I want you to do. That's a campaign. So you could argue point blank is a strategic. It's strategic going against the targets in Germany. You can argue later on to going against the targets in Japan. That's a separate campaign. These bombers are hijacked by Eisenhower and are used in what we call operational art. They're used as operational tools. These are, I wrote an article on it they call operational fires. In other words, there's Eisenhower's long-range artillery, which is exactly what the bomber barons don't want to do. What Harris, Doolittle, and Spaatz, the last thing they want to do is be seen in the post-war analysis as their primary role providing close air support to Eisenhower. That's the last thing they want to do. And the reality, of course, is they will do that from June 1944 all the way to September 1944. The number one job is crossbow. Number two job, crossbow going after the V1 and the V2 launchers, or those who haven't dialed into that. And number two is supporting the ground troops. I mean, it's never a question. If there's a target where you can use heavy bombers, we're using them. And they don't like that at all.
Yeah. And just to remind you folks, we're not going to be able to tackle, of course, all the themes in Stephen's brilliant book, because you have to go and buy that to get the full picture. We're concentrating on the D-Day beaches aspect and then the towns and the cities, because it's the human tragic aspect that is particularly important to you, and it's important to me, and it's important to Mag, who's watching in the other room over there. So we can't do everything in today's show, but it's important that what we are doing we tackle with honesty and clarity. And so far I'm really enjoying it. And I was just saying, it's lovely. It's so bad when you have a guest who doesn't have opinions. I'm being sarcastic there. You don't want anybody coming in there who's wishy-washy. I love your forthright nature, Stephen. It's very refreshing. Fantastic. So beyond the beach today, we're looking at the landings and the towns, aren't we? So let's talk about the landings.
Yeah. So the joint fire plan I'm not sure what you got for slides there. I don't get them all memorized. The Joint Fire Plan. There you go. It's a comprehensive plan, and you got to remember, this is when I say joint. What we're talking about is all services already combined. It's already all allied are involved. And now, again, for those who've forgotten, you've got Eisenhower at top, but all the second tier of guys, Ramsey and Lehigh Mallory and Montgomery are all Brits. And so what you end up having then is a joint fire plan, and it's designed, the purpose of that plan is to get the Allied soldiers ashore with the least amount of damage to them. And it's designed to neutralize, a very specific term, military, to neutralize enemy targets. That means you're not trying to destroy them all. You want to disrupt and dislocate them so they are no longer effective, at least for a given period of time.
Yeah.
And so the plan starts out, and it's really pretty simple. The Bomber Command is going after the 10 shore batteries that can cause problems. They're going to go after those. The 8th Air Force is going to take the bulk of the beaches, Gold, Sword, Juneau, Omaha. And then the 9th Air Force, which is a tactical air force, is going to use its B-26 bombers to take out targets along Utah Beach. They're the only ones that are flying at that level and are capable really of doing it. So there's a whole series of these things. And so we can talk. The British thing is called flash lamp. There it is. I mean, and I want to keep in mind why this whole thing intrigued me. When you combine the British bombers, when you combine them with the 8th and 9th Air Force, this is the largest synchronized air operation in history, period. Nothing else is as big, and it's the least written about air operation in history. So, you can find raids into Berlin and Schweinfurt all you want, right? This is the least. They put more effort into this mission than any other in history. So flash lamp, they start right after midnight and go after a series of 10 targets. It's as we talked about Kriesbeck and St. Marcouf in that area. They don't damage. They kill a number of soldiers in the facility, but the other thing is they kill more soldiers who are sleeping in downtown in the city, and they kill a whole bunch of civilians in the process. The battery itself, and this is why it's indicative of this one, Kriesbeck, which is up there on Utah Beach, just up off to the west. What's interesting is that it doesn't go away. I mean, Kriesbeck is still fighting the 4th Division a week after D-Day. On D-Day itself, they're running a artillery duel back and forth with warships, and sunk a couple of ships out there. So this is
taken out from the ground. In the end, it was neutralized by a good old-fashioned across-ground assault. Even though the Navy
was naval direct fire gunfire, and second was a major assault by the 4th Division, which, by the way, held it up for several days. They finally had to leave a regiment to guard it and bypass. So and then over at the Mirville Battery, the other end, across the Orne River, I mean, they were so inaccurate. They almost killed the British Pathfinders who were trying to get in there to take out the battery. So it's not a precise mission. It does some damage, but the flash lamp is essentially a wasted effort for the British Bomber Command. Now, this is the one that really gets my goat. Okay, so this is my favorite topic. I got a book coming out.
So just for the record, you're not even angry yet. We've only been warming you up. Okay,
it's appalling to me. Just gets me appalling, fired up. But before the fight, before as recently as the end of May and the beginning of June, General Doolittle is very clear that commanding the 8th Air Force, he's very clear that he's been training his crews and they think they can hit these targets. He feels pretty confident they've done enough training that they can go in and hit the beach targets on Omaha, Gold, Sword, Juneau, and Sword. But there's going to be a delay. You got another, which slide you got there? There's going to be these characters, okay? These characters. Orville Anderson, John Stamford, and Walt Todd. He is the A3. He is the A3 of the 8th Air Force, essentially the G3. Stamford in the center. he is the chief of staff. And then Walter Todd, Colonel Walter Todd on the right, he's the assistant A3, and he's really deeply involved in this whole mission. They decide on June 5th, on the night of June 5th, that they need to override General Doolittle. They're going to change the plan. And essentially what they do is, because they're using that H2X system, they're going to delay the bombing time. So when the operator comes rolling on up and he gets his target marker, and when he's supposed to say, drop, he's supposed to, depending on where it is, whether it's on Omaha or one of the other beaches, compared to the landing times, he's supposed to delay the count between 5 and 30 seconds. Now, these airplanes are flying at like 160 miles an hour.
Yeah.
I mean, we're flying serious at 160 miles an hour at 14,000 feet. So if you delay a bombing from 10, 15, 20 seconds, you're now in another county. I mean, you've just now gone 1.5 miles or so away from the target area. And that is essentially what happens for all of these. Now, here's where it gets to be a real rub, is that these guys, they make the decision. They tell nobody. They don't tell. It's Bradley and Montgomery and Dempsey that want these targets taken out. They don't tell anyone. But what they say they're doing is, they said, well, we passed it up the chain. We contacted SHAEF headquarters, and I mean, I got SHAEF headquarters. Yeah, we got SHAEF at AEF headquarters, and said we're going to do that. And Eisenhower approved it. And I got a whole long story someday, which I do in my little Osprey book, that talks about what happened. Bottom line is, they never ask Eisenhower for approval. Eisenhower makes no decisions on D-Day. Okay, I mean, when Eisenhower says the night before, let's go, he has absolutely nothing to do on D-Day. If you check all his things, all his reports, all his aides, all his advisors, and at AEF headquarters, where Vandenberg is the American deputy commander, none of them know anything about this delay. So after the fact, they end up making up this excuse that we asked for permission. Now, what I don't understand is, why didn't anybody ever push back on it? Because Eisenhower never gave the permission. Trafford Leon Mallory never gave the permission. Vandenberg never gave permission. And as a result, they missed all the targets on Omaha, Gold, and Sword. All the targets. And what ends up happening, my argument is very clear. Those gentlemen who made that decision, they killed a whole lot of Americans. And of course, the reason is they don't want to have fratricide. They know how inaccurate their weapons are. They don't want to have it fratricide. And so they think by delaying, that's a good thing. No, as somebody just put across the front, these are a lot of dead cows. That's exactly right. Except over in the British beaches. Because in the British beaches, they're much more built up, and it's much more urban. So over there in British and Commonwealth beaches, excuse me, I'm Canadians, the Commonwealth beaches, those beaches are they're much more urban. So as a result, we have rather significant casualties. 400 or 500 French civilians dead that we know of, and the French have done a marvelous job of trying to document them all. So a lot of dead cows in Omaha, and an awful lot of dead Frenchmen, more dead Frenchmen than Germans on the Commonwealth beaches.
And the irony being is, when our ground forces are now pushing inland from these beaches, which is beyond the scope of today's tour, the very people that we would like to help us with directions, and are there any Germans over there, and can you tell us where the water supply is, and are these we've just killed their mum and dad, possibly, or at the very least, we've destroyed their house.
I don't have any numbers on how many resistance operatives, because a lot of those guys are evacuated from the beach areas. Yeah. So I don't know how many people are still there and actually working with the resistance, but that's a whole other interesting study to look at. This is a mess. Yeah, we had a 2.5. Yeah, it's a whole long distance in the back. So
yet, ironically, the 9th Air Force do a far better job on Utah Beach, don't they?
Well, that's because of the 9th Air Force. But just one more thing about the 8th. These staff guys who made those decisions did a disservice, because the 8th had trained, they had practiced doing it, and they could have done things better. And in fact, they could have done it different. They could have had different formations. There are a whole lot of options they could have done. They're using the same formations they'd use over the heart of Germany. I mean, come on, So there are things they could have done they're not considered. They're not allowed to do it. They don't think much about it. Doolittle was essentially screwed on this thing by his staff. Yeah, the ninth
Air Force veteran told me many years ago that it was simply the wrong tool used for the job. It wasn't
Absolutely.
that the 8th Air Force was a poor unit, because it wasn't. It was just using it in a way it hadn't been used before, but using the same technique it'd been using. And he said it was like trying to drop a penny from the top of the Empire State Building into a milk bottle. It was just
fly in formations, 3 aircraft wide. I mean, think about it. And so the lead aircraft drops the bombs. The guys at the side. That's not precision fighting. That's not precision. Yeah, there's so many different ways you could have addressed this thing, and I'm surprised. I'm going to look. One of my tasks in the future is to go look more at the, what discussions were there about options. I'm not sensing any.
I mean, I don't want to go down another rabbit hole, but I've always wondered, given that the 8th Air Force has the large fighter bomber force of P-47s and other aircraft, why perhaps could they not have done a better job than the high-level bombing by the B-17s and B-24s? I don't know. I don't really like the counterfactual argument, because you can kind of prove anything with a what if. But I always do wonder that these fighters that were basically still sitting in East Anglia could have done something more effectively than the 4-engine bombers. But
the other one is, why was the 2nd Tactical Air Force used? They had a whole lot of good aircraft. They could have done the same thing on the Commonwealth beaches, and they didn't. So that's
I guess they're doing radar, though. Well, they're doing the radar stuff, aren't they?
Send the bombers, send the heavies.
Not all of them, though.
Yeah, send the heavies to get them. 9th Air Force on the beach. They do it exactly right. The 9th Air Force on Utah Beach does it exactly right. They're flying
down the beach,
low.
Perpendicular to the beach. Sorry, it's parallel to the beach, low level, and you've got potential targets under your flight.
I'm sure you've read the account by Arthur Jonke that talks about he's standing there, he looks up to the north, and they literally see his airplanes go across Dakota and the peninsula, and next thing you know, they turn on him. They're flying, Paul, they're flying at 5,000 to 7,000 feet. I mean, these guys are flying low enough that when they drop the bomb, if they're not careful, it's going to hit the aircraft. I mean, it's amazing how these guys come in, they do the job. They got really 3 groups of targets right around there, and they mix the targets up. Trying to plot which actual plane hits what target is almost impossible, because they're so close, and you've been there, and they all blend in together up and down the beach. But they do their job. And Janke's buried in the freaking sand by one of the flights, who was a platoon commander there at where the Americans, the 4th Division, 8th Regiment actually land. And man, there's not a lot of effective return fire from heavy weapons on that spot. And of course, the 4th Division lands brilliantly with very few casualties. Big time comparison to what takes place on Omaha, just across the bay there.
Yeah. And well, we'll briefly touch on naval bombardment, then we'll get to the meat of this talk, which is about the bombing in the cities. But naval bombardment briefly.
Yeah, just briefly. I just put that in there to remind that this joint fire plan was a sequence. It was a very carefully planned sequence of events, and the bombardment was also there that allowed them allowed them then to go ahead and hit those targets. And they're the ones that finally take out. And again, I mean, as we all know, the destroyers on the beaches did brilliantly, to the point of grounding themselves practically on the beaches, providing direct fire to some of the guys landing. I mean, real kudos.
But that wasn't part of the original plan.
No,
that was mostly improvised. The big ships sitting 8-10 miles off the shore, but doing their job. But it wasn't, as we now know, having a huge amount of effect on that, particularly the gun batteries like Long-sur-Mer and Crisbeck and Montfleury. But
Omaha especially, if it hadn't been for those destroyers, that's a great story. Yeah, how effective? Not so much. Yeah, let's move on to the towns. That's good.
Yeah. So, we'll just say about the Germans before we move on.
The Germans were there. I got a picture coming out in this bombing book of mine, where the Germans essentially they're all Widerstand Nest 62, of course, is the big one right there, near down from the American Cemetery, everyone knows. And they take the bombardment, and it all hits fields in the back. It doesn't hit anything. So they look behind them and go, oh man, what was that just, all shook up? There's nobody injured.
Yeah.
Of course, then the artillery fire from the coast shows up, and then you get Private Severlow up there and his group that are using their machine guns and working on the beach. So.
Yeah. Another story, but yeah. So when we come to evaluating the air support on D-Day, I think we know where you're going to go with this, but over to you.
It's very simple. A waste of effort, and it shouldn't have been. It was an essential part of the Joint Fire Plan, and people should have done the job. And that's the thing that amazes me. And there hasn't been an accounting for it. That's the thing I find most amazing. There was never an accounting for it. Those gentlemen, by the way, I mentioned, they went all on to senior commands and senior positions after the war. There was no accounting for that. Omar Bradley was stunned. He couldn't believe it. Why weren't they going to tell me? Why didn't they tell me?
Well, but this is the bit we've all been building to, isn't it? Because it's about the town. So because D-Day, unfortunately, was not the end of the errors in Normandy. It continues, and there's lots more loss of life. And we'll move on with that.
Yeah, what people should realize that this thing continues. This bombing effort by heavy bombers continues for over a week. For over a week, they're still plummeting France, and that's another. That truly is another book I'm going to work on, because there's a whole story of hitting all these towns many times behind the scenes, and it's just amazing. And next one has a list, I think. Where we get there? They call choke points. They're choke points, and the choke points. Essentially, this is a map of Caen. Now, this is Caen. And so you look right there where you get see C3 and C4. That's where the train station is right now in France, C3 and C. Yeah. And if you can look up there where C1 and C2 are, those are crossroads. But they all, by the way, happen to be locations of ancient, monasteries and churches and other establishments. And I say ancient, built, by William Conqueror and his gang. So this is a historically very rich town. And of course, you can see where the canal is there, just above C4, where the old inner harbor is, right? See that? Yeah. And just to the end of that is, of course, where that crossroads is where William the Conqueror's castle is today.
Yeah.
But that's the planning map they're using. They got a grid and everything, of course, but that's what they're giving people. There's no indication of what's under. And then you have this whole list of towns. And what Montgomery wants to do, Lisieux, Saint-Lô, Coutances, Argentan, Vire. What he wants to do is take the center of the town and rubble it. Now, again, most French towns, as we all know, they're built. The center is the market area, the inner part of the town. That's where people live. And in France, you don't necessarily have big, at least in the old days, didn't necessarily have farms out there, because they would walk from the center of the town out to the field. And then they also would have the markets in the center of the town, because right next to that harbor is also where the main market area is.
Yep.
Well, they want to rubble those intersections in all those towns, about a dozen towns. Holy mackerel. To think about the plan, and there are no Germans there necessarily. The idea is to cause the Germans to roll into those towns, but they can't get through, so they have to go out the countryside and find their way around. When you do that, you're destroying the French history, your culture, and you're killing and wounding a whole lot of people. We have Caen up. So on June 6th, that morning on June 6th, those 4 targets were identified by the 1st and the 3rd Bomb Divisions from the 8th Air Force. They were going to send a whole lot of bombers to hit those 4 targets. They couldn't find the targets. In one case, they said they dropped the bomb. They dropped the bombs. Nobody in Caen has any clue where they went. So what you end up having then is the people in Caen can hear the stuff that's taking place they can hear. If you're there and you hear explosions out there in Easterham, you can hear that stuff. So they're out. They're in the market. They know the fight's going to come to them. They can read a map. They're out in the city about 1 o'clock, doing their thing in terms of shopping and gathering stuff. And all of a sudden, about a little after 1 o'clock, all of a sudden you have a whole flight of B-24s fly overhead and drop their loads. I don't have the number in front of me. It's about 800. We lose an incredible number of people in Caen that day. I think it's about 1,100 in Caen all day, because it's going to get hit again. It's going to get hit by the 8th Air Force, by the Bomber Command. It's going to get hit again by the 9th Air Force. Then it's going to get hit by the 8th Air Force again the next day.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it, Stephen? Is it if I'm playing devil's advocate here, if this was to be the one and only bombing of these towns, and it actually prevented German reinforcements coming up, you could maybe justify it. But towns like Saint-Lô, Ony-sur-Odon, Villers-Bocage, Caen just got bombed again and again and again. Yeah. And it's interesting that, as living in France, that the French are legitimately starting to ask the questions now, Was this really necessary? Did you really do that? Yeah. They feel now enough time has passed. They're still grateful for the liberation. They're still, the welcome they give to American and British Canadian veterans is still there. They're still putting up monuments left, right, and center. And we're never going to say that the people of France are not grateful for the liberation, because they absolutely are. But alongside that, they can start raising these legitimate questions about, did you really need to knock out our city? Did you really need to do that? And
yes.
And I think, again, we're talking about the tourist aspect, is the American tourists, British tourists, they go to essentially the pretty places. Sainte-Marie-Église still has nice buildings around the square. Aramonge still has some nice buildings in the town there. Bayeux, where I live, is where most people live there, which wasn't bombed. When you go to places like Aulnay-sur-Odon or Villers-Bocage or some of those inland towns that are nice now, but they're nice because they have been rebuilt in the 1950s, 60s, 70s style.
Rebuilt.
There's where you see how there was the destruction. You don't get the sense of destruction in Sainte-Marie-Église because it wasn't targeted in that same way. And I think it's about time, you're right, that we do address this, and we're not accusing any bomb crews of doing anything wrong. We are respect, as we said at the caveat at the beginning, is bomber crews just do what they're told to do. And I had a cousin who was killed as a pilot of a Halifax bomber over Germany. He did his bit. He didn't ask where he was told to go, but he did his bit. But it's time to start asking questions. So yeah. So that's this is extraordinary, folks. Just the number of towns we bombed. And do you think this just, well, I know what you're going to say, the justification of this, meaning the Germans have to bypass these towns, you don't think it was worth the cost? I think
no. So first of all, the first thing, these are just the towns that are hit like June 6th and 7th. So when I finally get around to putting a big map together of all of them, it's a lot of towns that are hit. No, I'm again, as someone who is a military professional and someone who taught planning, I taught, developing war plans and did it on active duty. This is part of you're not supposed to preempt. It's a war crime. You don't do a preemptive bombing of a town. I mean, you don't preemptively destroy some, with the exception of Caen. And there's really there aren't any Germans in the center of the city. Very few. And it's like you're preemptively bombing the city just in case the Germans come through. I mean, that's just insane. And did you have to destroy? Do you have to destroy everything? We could talk sometime about the transportation plan. It's just that it wasn't a plan. It was attrition warfare. We're going to make a list of train stations, and we're going to destroy them all. Well, this is sort of the same kind of thing. Where are the Germans coming? Well, we don't know, but we better take out that crossroads before they get there. Again, it's like, what was the thought process to doing that? And it certainly in the modern era, there's no one would get away with the fact, well, just in case we're going to destroy a dozen cities behind the lines, just in case. You couldn't do that today. So to me, it's just this absolute. And again, the Germans will tell you the fighter bombers are what scared the hell out of them. It wasn't the heavy bombers. The fighter bombers are the ones that got them. The Typhoons and freaking Thunderbolts. That's what happened.
Yabos. Yeah. And just for the benefit of the viewers, Stephen, we know there is, in effect, an exiled French government in Britain. Charles de Gaulle, he may not be there at this moment, he's moving around the world a bit, but there are French representatives within the Allied command structure. Are they being asked what they think about this plan? Is anyone listening to them if they do get asked?
Yeah, well, first there are two channels. One is coming up from the French resistance, and they're very concerned about the bombing and the effect it has, weeks before this. So the French resistance is saying, hey, this bombing campaign you've got across France is hurting us bad, especially in regards to the transportation, the rail yards, because rail workers don't commute long distance in 1944. They live next to the rail yard. So if you hit a rail yard, you're hitting the workers. So they're concerned. But Pierre Koenig is Eisenhower is de Gaulle's person on the staff, and when he's asked about bombing, especially as it has to do with the rail yards, he essentially says, it's war. Do what we have to do. There's not a lot of pushback from the official French government on this.
Okay, so moving on, Saint-Lô, and as you know, this is close to my heart because, say, my other half is from Saint-Lô, and she was there today. So we're talking about the capital of La Manche. This is the market town. It's an administrative center. It's historic center. It's got history going back hundreds, thousands of years. It was a beautiful little town sitting on a river, and yes, of course, there have been comments, Stephen, about all these targets are on road hubs. They are, as you said, they are routes Germans could be using to get to Normandy. But as we know, the German units that reinforce Normandy, they all do get here. Whether they were ever significantly delayed by these cities being hit, I think is questionable, because the Das Reich arrived, 1st Leibstandarte SS arrived, 17th SS, Panzer Lehr, they all get here anyway, don't they? So I think, given the loss of civilian life, there's a legitimate question about whether or not the bombing of these cities was important. But I'll let you talk about the June the 6th, 7th plan.
Yeah, I mean, there it is. I mean, it's right, the enclose, the beautiful castle and the high ground above. I mean, that becomes the center of mass up there, that high ground. And I mean, there's a story. I mean, I got a story of this one gal who was going to school in. She was from. Where's she from? She's from Carentan, I think. And so she's going to school in St. Lo. Her grandmother lives there. Her aunt lives there. And they're in there, and they're and she goes to school on the morning of June 6th, and they say, no, the invasion, we're not going to have school today. She walks across town up this high ground away from town, goes up and visits her, said goodbye to all the boarders. She's got a whole lot of people in the boarding house that she is living with, and she says goodbye to them. We'll see you later. And she comes back after her and her family are watching the bombing from a distance. And then she goes back a couple of days later. Of course, everybody in that bombing house were all killed by that attack. I mean, this haunts her. When you read the testimony, this testimony haunts them for 40, 50 years later. It doesn't go away. Yeah, it doesn't go away. And so she's writing this many years later. And I mean, I thought, Paul, going back to why did I write the book, I thought that these pictures were the result of the bombing, the fighting that took place to seize St. Lo. I mean, I thought that the reason we had this destruction for most of my historical career was as a result of the fighting that took place in this city. And then I find out, no, this is the result of Allied bombing on June 6th and 7th. And I think you got a picture of the plaque that's outside the wall. Yeah, this is. Let me see. I got the picture. Let me see if I got these two guys, which are on my book. That's a very interesting story.
Mag did an entire show for World War II TV about the story of those boys and the fact their father was in the resistance and had been killed. And it's a great story.
Yeah, it's a great story.
A great story, tragic story, but it's an important story. Yeah.
And how? Yeah, exactly. And how do you end up? I mean, look at this. Yeah. Exactly. That's the one. I mean, you can't drive by. American tourists will drive by that and not have a clue to what they're talking about. But look at that. I mean, that is as clear as you can be on the bombardment. I mean, that is as clear as can be. Yeah, the numbers. The numbers are always an issue. The minimal number is about 75,000 dead from bombing, and you got to keep in mind, though, we don't have good numbers. You talk about the exode that takes place at the beginning of the war. Well, you've got 8 freaking million Frenchmen on the road running away. I mean, can you imagine? In Texas is 10 times the size of freaking not 10 times. But Texas is the same size as France. So can you imagine all the people in Texas running on the road trying to get away, or even the United States? We're 10 times the size. Imagine instead of is 32,000. So imagine that number. That'd be like 80,000 800,000 Americans running away trying to get. Could you imagine that many people on the freaking road? I mean, it's just amazing. Not all of them go home. Not all of them go home, and that's the real issue. Is so that a lot of people are hiding in there on the coast or in the cities where the bombing takes place, and they're not accounted for. We don't know who they are, and there's the French have whole long lists of bodies. We don't know. They're not wearing dog tags. We don't know who they are.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it, Stephen? I mean, I was told many years ago is because American visitors will say, so there's the British cemetery or the Commonwealth cemetery there. There's a German cemetery there. There's an American cemetery. Where the Frenchmen say, well, they're in the individual churchyards of France, but there are, of course, the others who are under the rubble of the cities, because cities like Le Havre and Saint-Lô and Caen have an immediate decision to make. Is, do you sift through every ounce of rubble to find every dead person below it, or do you get water and amenities on and start looking after living? And with the people who are moving around France, hiding from the service travail obligataire, the people, refugees, families were moving and staying with each other because they were moving away from the battlefield, so cousins would come and live with you for a while. That, as you know, because you've written about this, every mayor of every village did that report at the end of the war about how many people from their village, if they knew, had been killed. But they could only say the ones they knew. They didn't know who was sheltering in buildings that might have been staying there.
Who's away and it never comes home. You know, when you read about this stuff, I know we're sort of winding down. When you read this stuff and you read the reports, especially in the case of Lisieux, and then I go back to Lisieux and I walk into the cemetery, and there is the family that I'm reading about where this guy who survives is from, you know, and he lives his life with missing a leg, you know, watches Americans come through and watches tourists come through for years and years later. Man, it's a tearjerker. I cried a lot when I wrote that.
So I think we know what your opinion is about the bombing of the cities there, but on the subject of, you know, as we know, before we went live, we talked about our mutual friend John McManus and the other people who are continually churning out books about the Normandy campaign, some brilliant ones, some less brilliant ones, documentaries still being made about it. Tourists are still coming here, or they will again when the COVID pandemic is over. But isn't it about time this sort of story of civilian loss was put into the American narrative? And if it is about time, do you think it will happen, or do you think that ship has sailed and it won't really ever be part of it now?
Well, I think we're starting to see it more. We're starting to see authors do more and more of that. I'm looking on my shelf over here. James Holland has added some more of that stuff to it. Well, so there are a number of guys. Peter Caddick Adams, he's added some more stuff to it. So I think there's more and more of this being added to the narrative. The piece about the bombing later on, I think, is really important. That's why I think no one really knows how long this thing goes on. But it does. It goes on for another week after June 6th. Yeah. So I really think that's on my long-term list of things to do, is to kind of lay that out.
And I think we've talked about it just even this. I think yesterday we talked about it. We need more collaboration between French and American and British authors and historians, because there has been this nationalistic approach to it. I did a couple of shows last year about Operation Charnwood and the taking of Caen. Karine, my French guest, talked about some of the casualties in Caen, how they're reevaluating. They're looking at these statements made even by the French after the war, saying 70% of the village was destroyed or 80% was destroyed, and saying, what does that actually mean? What do we mean by destroyed? Is the roof missing destroyed, or does destroyed mean level to nothing? And so the French are starting to examine what is meant by words like destruction and destroyed and rubble, and they're now starting to look at the civilian casualties.
Younger generations. It's the younger generation. The older generations have too much baggage. They had too much baggage, too many other
things. That's the thing. I mean, Mag, who's in the other room watching, she always, you talked about Crisbec, and her family's from Crisbec, and the battery there that's been done as a museum now. Every year, well, not with pandemic, they have a kind of a festival of history where they have fireworks and things, and they effectively kind of recreate the bombing campaign. They have loud explosions in the air. Now, that's great if you're, well, I'm using a word, I don't agree with it, great, but it's okay if you're a 15-year-old kid coming here looking at it. But there are people living within earshot of that who lived through this for real. Do these people really want to be reminded of that devastation? Mag's own father was in Saint-Marcouf on D-Day as an 8-year-old, and her story, which you don't know because you don't know Mag, is that a German kind of advised their family, you know what, something's brewing. If I were you, I'd move inland. And they did move inland. Now, in fact, their house wasn't hit, but it might have been hit. So they have a kind of family story where a German actually kind of helped them. But it's when Americans and British visitors don't understand the bombing narrative of Normandy, I can guarantee you the elderly French and their descendants absolutely know the story of, and it's been something that they haven't felt open to talk about if American veterans come back there. The last thing you want to do is when American Mag's best friend Pete, who was a veteran of a unit that liberated San Lo, the last thing she's going to remind him when he comes back is, by the way, your nation, you destroyed this city as well. It's just not part of the done thing.
There's much we could get into.
Yeah, no, definitely. So before we go, Stephen, what are you working on? Well, I know what you're working on right now, but for the benefit of our audience, what's your next project connected to Normandy?
Yep, well, I've got two. One is I'm finishing up a Osprey book. You guys are probably very familiar with Osprey, and it looks at just the bombing first missions on D-Day. The largest operation ever from the air, Bomber Command, 8th and 9th Air Forces. So that's the first thing. And I'm in the editing process with that right now. And then the second thing I'm working on is biography of Raymond O. Barton, 4th Division Commander on D-Day. I've got his personal papers that go all the way back from his family gave me, and I've also got his war diary that nobody's ever seen. So I'm integrating that with the official records and having a good time with that. So hopefully next year that'll be out too.
Just one question for you. We didn't do many questions really, but we have a question there about whether or not this kind of untold story about civilian bombing had any effect further down the line, perhaps in Korea and Vietnam, or did it influence, as by then the American Air Force becomes independent? Did it ever affect thinking in future wars?
Yeah, it's funny that the last thing the Air Force ever wants to do is support ground troops, and they had to do it again in Korea and Vietnam. So they did it grudgingly in both of those conflicts. And here's the other thing that I think is interesting: the guy that I mentioned, Orville Anderson, he was at the Air War College, and he was during the Korean War. He essentially arguing we should just be nuking the freaking Chinese right now and dealing with it. And of course, they just did that with Truman had just fired MacArthur. So Orville Anderson went away right after that too.
So unless you've got any other further statements to make, I think you've made your points brilliantly, strongly, forcefully, and as I say, it's the fact you're opinionated is just wonderful, because history is all about opinions, and it's refreshing. Mag, I know, on the other hand, is probably your greatest fan now, because she although we love dealing with American clients coming over and British clients, she feels that sometimes the Americans have just kind of forgotten this.
Well, the one thing to point out, I'm sensitive to the word opinion. I have got the data, and I've got the accounts.
Oh no, absolutely,
detailed data on every one of these missions. They happened. You can quibble about how many died on the missions, and you can argue about was it necessary or not. But I got the data, man.
Yeah, no, that's a great. I stand corrected. Your opinion is about some of the impact, but not about the decision making, and not about the operational side of it at all. So, yeah, I know it's been really brilliant. So I'll just remind people what we've got coming up tomorrow, and I'll come back and say goodbye to you in a second. So, folks, tomorrow evening we are on the ground again. We have David Bourque coming on, who is a Brit living in France, who is going to talk about Jean Moulin. Now, if you're French and you have any interest in World War II, you know exactly who Jean Moulin is, because he's one of the key figures in the French resistance, who basically is the one who kind of gets everybody to agree to work to the same goal under one kind of overall banner. But he was tragically captured and killed by Klaus Barbie on a train out of Lyon. So we'll talk about that tomorrow, and his amazing career before the war and during the war. And then, of course, Friday, Michael Nyberg's coming on to talk about the Vichy France. His latest book is an absolute outstanding book. I'm reading it right now. On Saturday, we're talking about one of the ground battles with Ian about the Royal Scots Fusiliers up near the Ypres Canal in 1940. So that'll be really good. But right now, it remains me to say thank you very much to Stephen for joining us, and I look forward to bringing you back on again to talk about Raymond Barton, because that'll be really good. And I feel there's a bit more mileage we can get out of the bombing of France if we want to hone in on something specifically in the future. And I've been impressed by your enthusiasm, your dedication to this subject, and frankly, a big thank you from me and Mag for highlighting this part of the war, because it, as we said, it doesn't get talked about enough. So
my pleasure, Paul. Anytime.
Thank you very much. So, folks, thank you for watching, everybody. This is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV. I will see you again same time tomorrow, 7 p.m. UK time, for the fantastic show about Jean Moulin. So thank you for watching. I will see you all again tomorrow.
Oh, he's gone.
Hello, he's still...